Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi and Bashar al-Assad, three leaders of West Asia who rose and fell in the corridors of power. From the 2011 Arab Spring to the 2024 uprising, West Asian nations have been on the edge, never really being stable economies, their citizens often standing against torture, executions and forced prison time. Even though the contexts are different, the images of Bashar al-Assad's fall bear some resemblance to the iconic scenes of Saddam Hussein's collapse more than 20 years ago. The toppling of statues of Assad, his father and his brother, Bashar al-Assad, is similar to those of Saddam coming down back in 2003. Assad's downfall did not come amid American tanks as during Saddam Hussein's, but the American factor remains constant in both. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated after being captured by the country's forces. Now, in all of these West Asian countries, regimes have been accused of bloodshed, oppression, and abuse of human rights. Many who lived through the torture testify the dictatorship that these leaders have been accused of. But there are a few who contest this thought. They say that for more reasons than one, the likes of Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein were developing their countries and were beneficial for them, and that the invasion and the labeling of West Asian countries is an American-driven propaganda. Let's try and get a wider perspective into this entire West Asian situation and the fall of the regimes one by one. On Global Mirror, I'm joined by Mr. Qamar Agha, Foreign Affairs Expert. Also joined with Professor Madhav Nalapa, Geopolitical Expert. We're also expecting Ambassador Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti to join us on the broadcast. Good evening and namaskar to both of you gentlemen. Mr. Qamar Agha, let me begin with you and understand from you how you see, this entire situation that has been prevailing in West Asia. It's been an unstable region for the past several years. One regime after the other, keeps collapsing, is toppling, and the leaders are accused of being dictators. There are people who are contesting that thought as well. They say that the American-driven propaganda labels them as dictators. What do you think of this, this entire West Asian situation that we've been seeing in the past several years?
Most of the Arab states are not modern nation state in one sense. They don't have a democracy ruled by mostly dictators. One party, one leader rule are there. There's no opposition. They don't tolerate dissent at all. This is a general case in 95%, 98% of the West Asian countries are. Now, there are two types of government. One are monarchic, where the monarchs are ruling, and the other is army dictators are there, like Baghdad, like Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Algeria, even in Egypt and many other countries, you would find this type of dictators are there. So these countries, these rulers, they don't work in the national interests. The regime interests in these countries have become the national interest of the country, or the ruler's interest. Let's put it, they have their interest and they work accordingly. Some are, had worked for development, like Iraq before Saddam Hussein was developing, one of the fastest developing country in the world. Then Gaddafi has also did some development in his country, but not much. Syria couldn't find, Syria was one country which hardly developed, The country is very good, one of the most beautiful country, and they had the plan to develop, but they didn't get chance because they were involved in number of conflict or war with Israel, and then, 2011 Arab uprising that was suppressed by and then later the Islamists came in, ISIS, Daesh and Islamic State, and then the state failed totally, So Syria was a different case altogether, but he's an out and out dictator, and he is responsible for the death of almost 50,000-60,000 people. This is what has been accused of it, and to preserve his state. But
Okay.
the regimes in
Okay,
Iraq,
okay. Let me get in
Syria.
Professor Nalapat into this conversation, Mr. Agha. Yeah, Professor Nalapat, how do you see this? Do you see them as dictators? Do you see them as, US labeled leaders who have been taken down and their regimes have been toppled because of a certain propaganda driven by the West?
Well, Shreya, I'd like to say that so far as many of these regimes are concerned, and frankly, they were ruled in a dictatorial fashion. Saddam Hussein did not allow any opposition to him by the simple expedient of killing anybody who he felt was against him. I mean, even if you're not against him, if he looked at you or his people looked at you and they said, oh, Shreya is against President Saddam, well, your days were numbered. So there's no question about that. I mean, Iraq was ruled by a tyrant. But yes, he was just one thing about him. He was not a fanatic. He's not a fundamentalist. And frankly, women were allowed to wear what they liked. And there were a lot of social freedoms there, but political freedom, there was none. So, Syria is also a dictatorship. Let's be honest. It was a family dictatorship for 50 years. And frankly, over the last 10 years, Bashar Assad became very complacent. Instead of trying to ensure that this country develops, as Mr. Agha has very correctly said, it's a beautiful country, tremendous people. He basically made a lot of money for himself and his family and took much of that abroad, a lot of it to Moscow, where he's now settled very comfortably with his family. Now, these people, Daesh, well, so many people have bragged that, oh, Daesh is finished. It is not finished. The idea of Daesh lived on in so many minds, and they're only waiting for an opportune time. In Syria, that time came when, frankly, the Russians were embedded in this war with Ukraine, and they were busy there. Iran was severely weakened by Israeli and non-conventional and conventional attack. And and Hezbollah, Hamas were severely weakened. So that is a good time to strike in Syria because they will be almost unopposed. So they rose again. They found sponsor. Erdogan is the so-called, I mean, the face of the revolution. He was very open in sponsoring them, but Turkey doesn't have money. It's got a huge inflation. It's got a low sinking employment rate. So somebody has given the money to Turkey to fund these people. And these people have come forward, and I can only tell you, Shreya, I can predict here that in the next 3-4 months, they're going to start fighting among each other. And you're going to see same bloody chaos that you saw in Iraq after Saddam's fall, and the same chaos that you saw in Libya after Gaddafi's fall. I mean, they were not perfect, there's no question. But what came immediately after them was terrible. And of course, fortunately, stability has come to most of
exactly what
such countries.
Mr. Agha has also said when we talked earlier, that this is going to not be so clear for al-Jilani to form a government there and rule Syria right now. It's going to be chaos. Let's also welcome Ambassador Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti into this conversation. Ambassador Chakravarti, namaskar, good evening. West Asia, Ambassador, has been so chaotic and unstable in the past several years. Has West Asia at any point been free from the proxy wars that it has been involved in? Has it had its own foreign policy and own domestic policies independently from the West, from the US, from the Russia? Has it ever had that sort of a geopolitical power over itself?
Look, one has to realize that the West Asian region is where the oil was discovered, and this is where oil, the control over oil created the geopolitical and the geoeconomic compulsion for many great powers to intervene there. And as always, the Americans were at the forefront of these kind of interventions. But so was Russia and or the Soviet Union at one time. And later on, China also came into the picture, etc. So, but I agree that, the problem with West Asia is that, and North Africa, the so-called Arab-speaking regions, is that none of them are really true democracies. The only exception, perhaps, I mean, one might agree or disagree, is probably Israel to some extent, because I've lived in Israel, so I've seen democracy functioning there. But the rest of them are all either dictatorships or monarchies, etc. And then, of course, the influence of the Islamic radical organizations like the Brotherhood, etc., has been one of the things that has always created, a conflict in that region, apart from oil and control of oil, etc. And then, of course, the question of having, Saddam Hussein, for example, was toppled because the Americans, sort of build a narrative that he was building nuclear weapons, etc., which was untrue. But then that's what they thought they would do, and they did it because it was kind of revenge for Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. So there are a lot of these geopolitical, cross currents that have crossed West Asia. But today in Syria, what you see is that Syria was always on the regime change list. If you listen to the interview of General Wesley Clark, who was one of the senior most generals in the American army, where he talks openly about the list that was formulated for regime change, in which Syria also figured. And that because Assad, 53 years, I think the Assad family ruled, and today they are not there anymore.
Yeah.
The fact is they were brutal rulers. They suppressed dissent and with a very, very heavy hand, with torture, etc. And all. And it did create, but then the Arab uprising also added to that suppression and the brutality. And that's where the other powers got into the game.
Okay.
Turkey, USA, Russia, Iran, and everybody started interfering in Syria for their own reasons. And Russia, of course, had this has this large, base in Tartus and along in the Mediterranean, because they needed a base in the Mediterranean to operate, because they don't have access to the Mediterranean. So these are some of the issues that complicated Syria's sort of politics. And of course, finally, what happened was that ultimately the Russians and the Iranians could not prevent. They were the main supporters of Assad, of the Assad family.
Yeah, which is then also seen as a setback for Russia and Iran, especially, with the kind of war that Russia is involved in right now. But Mr. Agha, can I understand from you, all of you say one thing, and that is the fact that democracy doesn't prevail in most West Asian nations. And when we talk about that, why has it been that West Asian countries, most of them at least, have not been able to achieve democratic processes, successful democracies in their countries? Is it just that tussle between the Shia-Sunni communities, or is it more than that? Has it got more to do with the oil-rich countries, the resources they have? What is it that keeps on preventing them from not having democratic processes and democracies in their countries?
There are a number of things. All of these things which you have mentioned contributed to dictatorial regimes, or prevented democracy coming into being. First thing, with the decline and then finally disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, the weak dependent states were created by the Britishers and the French in this area. So most of the states are weak, were very weak and dependent. And this area was not developed much by the Ottomans. They were themselves very feudal, backward colonizers in some way. But they provided peace and stability for almost 400 or 500 years to this region. Secondly, in the absence of democracy, what has happened, the militant Islamic movement emerged in these countries. And that was also promoted by some of the countries. So thirdly, as Ambassador Pinaki has mentioned, oil is one thing, which is a major factor there, and thirdly, the type of religious ideologies promoted by the a section of clergy and lesser clergy particularly, and backed by powerful oil-rich kingdoms of Persian Gulf region, So all of them, then Islamic militancy or Islam jihad become the instrument used by big powers in Afghanistan, and it was not. Then jihad was not rolled back; it continues. Pakistan used it, and it continued. Now, with the fall of Khilafat in Baghdad or in Syria, also,
Yeah.
part of it, this decline started. The Muslims have come to realize that Islamists, cannot deliver. But these organizations are still there, as Professor Nalapat has mentioned. The idea is still there, and now they are acting. Many of them are as mercenary force. They need money, they need weapon. They are being provided by different countries to them, and they are serving their interest in different countries. This is what we have been seeing in Syria. This is what we have been seeing in many other places, particularly in the
Okay.
sub-Saharan region. So the many outside interference is too much. Some dictators are nationalist, they are secular, they wanted development, but couldn't make it, because of the sanction, because they took anti-American stance. So American imposed sanctions like on Iraq, then on Syria, Libya, many other countries, So because that was also one of the factor for
Yeah, so
backwardness of the
multiple
region.
reasons, of course, contributing
Multiple.
to the kind of chaos, West Asia sees. Professor Nalapat, right from the 2011 Arab Spring to what we saw this year in Syria, and all over these several years, we've seen several protests, uprisings, chaotic situations, citizens particularly also speaking out against the dictatorships prevalent in their respective countries. Do you see any sort of resolution happening? Do you see, perhaps with a Donald Trump coming in, there's going to be a tighter hand in dealing with West Asian countries, and that they should be having democratic processes? How do you see that? Do you see any sort of resolution, at least in the near future?
Well, Shreya, sadly, I'd like to say no. I mean, when the 2011 Arab Spring took place, I had said that it's going to be a Wahhabi winter and extremists will take over. And they did in a number of countries. But fortunately, in some of them, the moderates recovered and got back power. So, frankly, I don't see the what you're calling democracy anytime soon. In Syria, for example, the country is headed for absolute chaos. There are at least 5 or 6 recognized factions in this present government. And there are actually about 130 formations, which are basically, as Mr. Agha mentioned, of a Daesh orientation, which is hatred against anyone who does not have a very hard-line view of religion, a view which, frankly, is not promoted at all by the religion itself. And it's a fringe within a fringe. Unfortunately, fringe within the fringe is the most organized, and they tend to run the show. They tend to come to the front of the show. It happened in Egypt. Mohammed Morsi of the Brotherhood was made the president before he was, Egypt was taken over by General al-Sisi. Morsi would have been a disaster. But anyway, I don't see anything. And as for Donald Trump, he has got some very good picks, I must say, in the cabinet. And his focus is not going to be very much on West Asia. It's going to be on China, Europe, and very much on India as well. So I don't see much of an interest in West Asia for a simple reason that oil has ceased to be very dominant where West Asia is concerned. You've got Russia, you've got the shale sands of the US are now going to be emptied of their oil by Donald Trump. You've got so many other oil finds that West Asia is becoming much less important in the global oil market. And therefore, as has correctly been said by the previous discussants, the interest is also subsiding. I don't see Donald Trump basically bothered about, what we call the Middle East, Shreya.
Okay. Ambassador Chakrabarti, when we talk about India, The Modi government has made an effort to reach out to the West Asian countries. There are several countries where Prime Minister Modi has visited, and he's become the first Indian Prime Minister to visit in several decades. In terms of the kind of outreach that the Indian government is doing to West Asian region and how the chaos is unfolding in these countries, how do you see India dealing with the situation now?
Well, I think, Syria was not very economically important for us. But we had some interest in Syria because they were, the Baathists were both in Iraq and the Baath Party, for example, which with Baath in Arabic means Renaissance, and they basically, it was a secular kind of an approach to politics. And so both in Syria and Iraq, the Baathist parties were important. So, and they, by the way, also were sympathetic to India in terms of its, foreign policy objectives. Even on Kashmir, I think both Iraq and Syria are supportive of India. In that sense, India engaged with them in a very positive manner. And of course, we don't make value judgments on their domestic sort of politics and sort of get into what the Americans call the regime change operations. So we had reasonably good relations with them, but it was not anchored in great economic or roots, which is different from what we have with, say, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, where 9 million people work. Okay. We have huge trade, oil, etc. So our interest in Syria was kind of secondary and peripheral in many ways. But we did admire, support Syria because of its very secular approach. And Syria is a very ancient country, and it's a very pretty country. Lots of communities lived there, and they lived fairly in harmony in many ways. But then we talk about democracy, why it doesn't take root in these West Asian countries. I think you will need another discussion to really get to the bottom of it. But let's say that democracy hasn't taken root. And today, India will have to face the fact that it's the Hayat whatever the name is, HTS or something, Hayat al-Sham, I think.
Yeah, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
They have taken over power, and they are an offshoot of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The kind of government they will run, I think some indications are already there. They will be like another Taliban, and I don't know. And they want to attack Israel, and they want to occupy Jerusalem. Some of them have said so.
So I think, Ambassador Chakrabarti, it's going to be appropriate to say that India would like to be a distant friend of the West Asian countries. We will not get deeply involved in the chaos, but we will remain a friend. We will maintain a healthy relationship with the West Asian region. I have to wrap this up, and let's see what happens in the West Asian region. But thank you very much to all of you gentlemen for joining us and helping us understand the West Asian region and the perspective of the countries in a much better manner. Ambassador Chakrabarti, Mr. Qamar Agha, and Professor Nalapa, thank you very much to all of you for joining us on Global Mirror. All right, with that, it's a wrap on Global Mirror.